So it's a pleasure to introduce Peter. We tried to get him last year, but he couldn't make it. So I guess there is some benefit to do things on Zoom. So Peter works as an associate professor at the Department of Methodology and Statistics at Utrecht University, where he specializes in survey methodology, which includes inferences using a mix of survey data and big data, and the modeling of survey errors and the use of sensor technology in smartphones. He has published extensively on the methodology of panel studies, especially on dropout from panel studies. In the last few years, he has been involved in several studies that use smartphone apps to record both survey data and sensor data over time. He is a senior researcher at Statistics Netherlands and has worked with Statistics Netherlands to use smartphone apps as an innovative way to produce statistics on topics such as time use, travel behavior, and household budget. And today's talk has an intriguing title, What Internet Panel Surveys Can Learn from the Design of Smartphone App Studies. Peter, it's all yours. And in principle, you have something like 45 minutes, and I can tell you when you sort of get to the limit. If it's shorter, that's fine too. I'm sure there will be ample discussion afterwards. So the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you. I'm honored to be here and to talk with you about smartphone apps. So I'm hoping, by the way, that you can all see my screen and hear me well.
Sure.
If not, at any point, just shout. Right. Okay. So thanks also for the extensive introduction. There's not a lot I can add to that. So I've done some work on panel surveys. Not very much in recent years. So in recent years, I've sort of changed topics, and I'm now working more on smartphone apps. I'm not doing this work all by myself. Actually, there's a long list of people that I have to thank. Most of the things in this talk are actually not things done by me, but actually done by other things. I just kind of put them together today. There's two people I want to single out today. The first one is Bella Snuinskaya, who is also here today. She's been really a great driver of this project and also another project that she will actually tell about in the next session, and I will stay away from today. And the other people I want to single out are the people from Statistics Netherlands. Most of you have maybe heard about that organization. It's the National Statistical Institute of the Netherlands, much like the Census Bureau. And they have actually funded a lot of the work that I'm presenting today, and they've actually done a lot of the data collection. And you actually see a long list of people here from Statistics Netherlands, and that is because doing work with apps is actually, it's a lot of work. It's quite intense, and there have been many, many people involved in making all of this work. All right, so I'm going to start with a picture of an app that will actually be a recurring example today. It's an app that we used before Corona, so actually at the end of 2018, to collect travel data. So Statistics Netherlands runs an annual travel survey, which is kind of like a diary study. We ask people to keep track of their trips for a period, for a number of days, including like their start and end points, their mode of transport, who they travel with, some other details. And this survey in particular, but there's actually quite a few other surveys at Statistics Netherlands as well, suffer from problems, low response rates, but also measurement problems. So there are quite a lot of surveys where we know there are problems with measurements. For example, if you're relying on retrospective data, or if you ask a lot about behavior, right? And so travel is one of the behaviors that we know we can actually track nowadays, right? So we all use, or most of us use, some app on our mobile phone to get us from A to B, and it kind of makes sense from an intuitive point of view, I think, to also use these kind of data in research. So this is the travel app, but if you look at the field today, the research field, there's actually a lot of other studies exploring the issue of how to work with apps. I'm just going to show you a couple of examples. I don't mean to give you a complete overview of all the studies out there, because there are many, but just to give you a taste of what things are being done. So another app that's actually now in its second round, and I'm now showing you the screenshots from the first rounds. So it now looks different than the screenshot I'm showing you here, is actually an app that is being used for household spending. So this is an app that's being fielded in Understanding Society, which is a panel study in the United Kingdom. And there, one of the things they want to find out is how households spend their money. Again, here you have to rely on a lot of, you would typically normally do a diary study there, but it's a lot of effort for respondents and problems with measurements. And they've done a lot of work on working out how to use an app here to improve data on household spending. So there's a list of references at the end of the talk, and I can see when I can make it available if in case you're interested in reading more about this. The third example is actually an example on time use, and the screenshots here are from a study that was conducted in Zambia in Africa, where they tried to get an idea about how people spend their time. And in this app, they actually used icons as the main sort of way to get people to report on how they use their time. And so you see also that apps are being used not only in panels and in the Western world, but elsewhere. What the three examples here have in common is that they all are kind of diary studies, right? So for both time use, spending, and travel, typically people rely on diaries, and these diaries have big problems. They're also, in a way, somewhere in the middle of a cross-sectional study and a longitudinal study. So the idea of these diary studies is, of course, that you complete the diary over a period of time, sometimes a few days, sometimes a few weeks. So in a sense, it's not a real panel study, but it's still a longitudinal component in there. It's the same respondents who report on these kind of things for over time. All right, I'm going to zoom in just to give you another example of what kind of developments are going on. This is a screenshot from a paper diary where someone kept track of what they eat, right? So their food intake. And for anyone who has been involved in diary studies, this is often, even if you provide a clear some guidance for respondents on how to report on food intake, this is often how you get the diaries back, right? There's a lot of scribbles and notes, and it's a lot of work to actually get this into a state that's where you can actually do analysis. So also in this field, I think people are exploring apps. This is actually not a research app, but this is an app that's being used by a company like Weight Watchers, where people can actually self-monitor their food intake. So you just search for products, you type them in, and then at the end of the day, you get a kind of overview of how many calories you ate, but also what were the kinds of ingredients that you had. And these apps are actually really popular. There's a reason I'm showing them here. If you look at the Play Store or these apps, a lot of people have these apps on their phone, so they self-monitor what they actually eat. And if you would look into the future, of course, these apps still have problems, right? You still rely on self-completion. So respondents still have to keep track of what they do and complete all whatever they eat in the app, which is actually quite a lot of work. There are now studies, these are more exploratory studies, I think, that for example, also work with pictures, right? So imagine you could take a picture of something you are having for dinner, and then maybe you could automatically classify, right, what it is that you're actually eating here. I see some carrots and some peas, I believe. This is still in the future, right? I haven't seen any examples where they actually use this in practice, but this is what you can do with apps, right? Maybe a bit outside our field, in a way, there's also lots of things happening with apps. So mainly in psychology, ecological momentary assessment, EMA or ESM, is very popular, where you ping people at random times of the day and you ask them one or just a few questions, for example, about how they're feeling. In the field of citizen science, so where people do observations, apps are also very popular. So the app that you see here, the screenshot, is from the Great Backyard Bird Count, which is an annual study where they ask people to locate birds in their own backyard. and they do word counts. It's not, I mean, it's being used for science, but it's also, I think these citizen science projects are mainly there to actually involve people in research, not to actually produce high quality data so much. And finally, the screenshots on the right are taken from a what they call mobile behavioral intervention, where actually people use apps to, for example, monitor their pain levels. Right, so people can then self-monitor if they come home after surgery, and they can indicate what kind of pain levels they have, and then maybe adjust their pain medication. So these kind of apps are being used a lot outside of survey research as well for all kinds of things. Right here, I don't have screenshots, but I'm just showing you some articles. Another reason why people sometimes use apps nowadays is to actually reach people that are otherwise very hard to reach or to keep track of. So there is a famous article by Naomi Sugi, who followed people released from jail for a while. You can imagine that these are people that very often move around from house to house, don't have a very stable life. And so the smartphone app there was actually a smartphone app to keep track of what they do and to actually ask them questions. And a similar strategy was used in Germany to, for example, follow refugees who arrived from Syria in 2015 and 16. We had a big influx of refugees from Syria in Europe. And in Germany, they actually use an app to interview these refugees. Again, with the idea that these refugees often are relocated from one asylum center to the other, and it's very hard to keep track of where they are going. The final example here is, for example, that this is actually the reason that this example is in, is that this is one of the oldest subfields where people are using apps. It's in monitoring of patients, and in this example, these are patients with schizophrenia. So the idea is that these are people that for example, have different travel patterns than normal people. And one way to monitor how they're doing is to actually track their locations so that you can actually see how well or not well they are doing. Right, so smartphones are great, right? And for all these kind of things, there's many purposes why you would use a smartphone and an app for data collection. So why don't we use it all the time? Well, there are. So I think nowadays you see actually some what we would say normal surveys even using apps. So the screenshot on the left is from the IAB Smart panel. This is actually sort of a sub-panel from the past study, where actually the app was developed to collect some sensor data. So for example, locations and other things, and also to experiment with various ways to use apps in research. But it was also just used to administer questionnaires to people. And the other screenshots that you see here are from a project that I'm currently involved in the Netherlands. So sorry, the screenshots are in Dutch. But this is actually a project, it's a cohort study where we follow people for a period of 10 years. And this is also done through an app. And the reason why we chose to use an app here was that we are following young people, adolescents, and we believe that in the 10 years that we will follow them, these are also people that will often move out with their parents and maybe move into student dorms or whatever it is they do. It's going to be very hard to keep track of them. And we thought maybe an app is the way to keep these people involved and to actually track them. All right, so apps are good. Why don't we use apps more widely, right? Or phrased differently, when do we use an app and when do we not use an app? When should we use an app, right? Or so for panels, you can maybe imagine that a lot of the things that we collect on panels are things that we could hypothetically also collect on apps, right? So panels and apps have a lot of similarities and differences. I will take a while to actually discuss these and also to come up with what I think are some consequences for how we design studies, right? So I think there's things that we can learn from the way people nowadays conduct app studies. So some common practices in apps that are commonplace there, but not in panels. Also, there's the other way around. I think apps can also learn a lot from people running panels. I will use a running example, so I will refocus on the travel study to show you some examples of what is being done. All right, so similarities. So I've touched on some of these already, right? So panels and apps, usually you don't produce an app to just do a cross-sectional study, right? It's a lot of work to produce an app. So you typically want the app to run on the phone for a while. and study change of some sort within individuals. Often these studies are also interested in variation across individuals, and they want to say something about some population, right? So these are all things that they have in common. Recruitment is a problem, right, in panels, but also in apps, and I will show you that it's often a bigger problem, I think, in apps than in panels, but that the patterns of non-response may actually be different. And finally, survey questions are important, both in apps and in panels. All right, so what are the differences? I think panels and apps differ on 4 key aspects. These are measurement, the infrastructure, so how they're set up, the kind of populations that they study, and actually how we try to communicate with respondents. And I will touch upon each of these topics and also show you some examples. All right, so measurement. I think for panels, it's safe to say that in most panels, most of what we ask our respondents to do is answer questions. So I put a number here, 95%, which I know is risky. In some panels it's more, in some panels it's less, but the main thing respondents do is answer questions. Apps also can include questions, but usually they include more than just questions, right? So often apps use sensors on the smartphone to somehow collect more data than just questionnaire data. Here's an example. So I'll first show you screenshots from the old web diary study, as it is currently still being conducted in the Netherlands. The idea is here people have basically a web survey, and they type in where they went, right? So they type in the town that they went to, and then they type in the address that they went to, and from the starting location, the app the website can then automatically detect how far a trip was, like how long it took, and then the respondent answers some more questions about modes of transport, etc. This has to be done for every trip, right? So it's actually quite a lot of work, and it's very easy also to make mistakes in the town, in the address, etc. All right, so the idea was we can do this better, right? We can use a smartphone app. The idea here was to track people for a week and to use a combination of GPS location sensors, but also Wi-Fi sensors to sample people's location every minute when people were stationary, so at home usually or at work, and every second when people were moving. So we chose these 2 different ways of tracking in order to both get precision, but also to save battery life. All right, I'm going to show you how the app works in a couple of videos. So the idea was if people installed the app on their phone, the phone would automatically track where people would go, and it would populate a diary for the respondent. So based on the movement patterns, the respondent would actually see a diary style list that includes stops. So here, if you look at the screenshot on the left, you see thuis, which is the Dutch word for home. That is a stop, right? So this person was there from about 9:30 at night until 8:30 the next morning. And then after that, you see that there's a trip that was 0.9 kilometers. So that's about half a mile. And then there's another location, et cetera, et cetera. So the respondent didn't have to do anything, right? This is all pre-generated by the app. So the respondent could still do some things in the app, and I'm just going to show you how the app worked. So if a respondent would click on a particular location, so here you see a location. This is actually the central station in Utrecht. The respondent could here type in what is actually the name of the location. So this wasn't really important. We didn't ask respondents to do this, but we thought like, well, we could give respondents the option of doing this. It would make maybe the app a bit more fun for the respondents, but also it would give us some information about the reason why a certain trip was made. So if I move over to the panel here, you see the respondent is now going to click on the same location here. And next to giving a name to this location, the respondent can actually also say, what was the reason that you visited this location? So in this case, it was a transfer. These screenshots that you saw here were actually the version that was made for Android. The thing here that still remains on your right-hand side is how the app looked on Apple devices. I'm now gonna, so this is obviously a different person here. I'm now gonna see show you what happens when you click on a trip. So this is a trip. And then a respondent can actually select the mode of transport. So in this case, it's on foot, and metro is like the underground, the tube. So in this trip, there were actually 2 modes of transport that were being used. So, and you see what happens if people do this, they actually see a green tick mark. So respondents actually get some visual feedback on that a task is actually completed. And what we found, so we didn't communicate to respondents that respondents had to do this. The only thing we told them is keep the app running on your phone for 7 days. But what we saw is that actually almost all respondents did this. They provided this extra labels for us. And for especially the modes of transport for trips, this is actually something that was really useful for us and that I will show you a bit later. So just for fun, I'm going to show you here, this is a map of the Netherlands. And I hope my video now plays. You should be able to see, it's a bit, okay. So you see here trips in the Netherlands. Doing this over the internet is a bit rough for the app. You see the time changing, so it's now 7:30 in the morning, and all the black lines are here now trips that are being made, so 9 o'clock. You see some trips going abroad. The longer trips by train and car are the ones that stand out. And these are all, this visualization is made by just taking the GPS points. They're all time-stamped, of course, so we know when a particular trip is made. And then we plot it on a map. So this is already very useful information. Of course, you're not seeing here all the trips that are made on foot, because you would have to zoom in a lot, and I can't do that for privacy purposes. All right. So from this example, I think there's already a couple of things that we can take away, right? So there's more than questions in apps. So in this case, we're actually using GPS sensors and Wi-Fi sensors as the basis for data collection, right? And the questions are actually supplementary to the sensors. The second thing is, and this is something that I think is very common in all research apps, is that the initiative of completing the data is really with the respondents, right? So we're actually collecting data almost continuously with the sensors, and we then kind of leave it up to the respondents to decide when and where they want to actually provide us some extra information about what they actually do. And this is, I think, in contrast to what panels typically do. That is, panel managers prepare a questionnaire and they send it out to all their respondents at a fixed time and by email, and then they can report this. So as a consequence, I think, of the way that apps collect this data continuously, we have to do something, right, to make sure that respondents actually keep the app running on their phone, but also that they return to the app to actually maybe complete some of this data. And so what you see in apps commonly is that apps provide some feedback to respondents, right? So in some of the earlier screenshots, I also showed you, for example, an overview of the types of products that people spend their money on. So that's being categorized and that's being fed back to respondents. So respondents get an idea of how they spend their money. So this idea of feedback, and also actually of gamification, that it all should be fun and nice to look at, that you get some graphs. That's very important in apps. I think you see that all the time. All right, so that's measurement. Then infrastructure. So a panel usually is a web survey that is linked to some sort of panel database. So the people in the panel database get invitations for the web database. And typically, I think if you design this infrastructure, so both the panel database and the questionnaires, this is a design that's been in place for actually quite a long time. So typically you use a similar design for a very long period of time. The panel can run for sometimes like 10 years. It's relatively cheap and quick. I know that you may disagree with that, but it's at least very cheap and quick to field a questionnaire, right? It doesn't take a lot of work to actually do that. And actually setting up the web survey and the panel database is also not that difficult, right? You see a lot of actually customer panels. Lots of people have panels. Another thing that I think is very good actually with panels, that panels have become really good at, is that all respondents can nowadays, I think, use a panel. And again, not all respondents, because you have to be able to read and write well. but at least it's accessible for the general population most of the time. And the data that we get out of panels are usually quite ready to analyze. We don't have to do a lot of work to actually get the answer to the research questions that we want. Now with apps, this is actually very different. So app development is a lot of work. It took us a year, I think, to get from the first prototype to a version of the app that we could actually put into the field. And there were actually multiple developers involved. Another disadvantage of apps, I think, is that we find out that it's actually quite costly to maintain apps. Because with every new version of Android or iOS, there's a lot of things that you have to change to apps. And so if you look in practice, a lot of the research apps that are being used just for a while, and then they are being abandoned because it is so costly to maintain all these different apps. It's expensive and it's slow. Another problem of apps is that not all our respondents are familiar with how to work with an app, right? You have to actually install it using some sort of Play Store on your phone. You have to locate that. Sometimes you have to give the app all kinds of permissions to actually work. And finally, once we get the data out, there's actually quite a lot of data processing that needs to be done. So earlier I said it's easy to put the locations on a map. That is true. But if you actually want to produce some statistics with it, there's actually a lot of data processing that you have to do. And to give you an illustration of that, here is a cross table that you don't have to zoom in on all the numbers. But given the label, so the respondents in our app, they labeled the trips, right? So the trips that they made, they said what kind of modes of transport they actually used. And here's an overview of the modes of transports that they use. So most trips are being made by car or on foot. And you can, of course, then also generate some statistics about what these trips are, right? So what's the average speed per trip? How many locations are actually, how many observations do we have in every trip, etc. So this is something that's still rather easy to get out of the app for the trips that were actually being labeled. Now, not all the trips were being labeled, right? There were also quite a lot of trips that the respondent did not label. And so then what we have to do is we have to actually predict what kind of mode of transport is being used. And that's a lot of work. You have to actually build a statistical model, use a training data set, and then test all kinds of variations of the prediction model and determine what works well. And actually, it took someone almost a year to end up with a model that we thought was fit for publication, that actually led to a model that we could actually use. So, so here we have, again, the labeled trips now in a column. I'm now grouping all the trips together. So on average, you see that per trip that was labeled, we get about 347 GPS location observations. And the median duration of a trip was about 550 seconds, so slightly less than 10 minutes. And the distance was slightly over 2 kilometers, so roughly 1.5 miles. What we can do, and this is something that I think is very interesting, but this is also to show you how much work it is. We could, of course, compare these labeled trips, the trips that were being labeled by respondents, to the trips that were left unlabeled by respondents, to actually see, right, does it matter? Can we use these labeled trips? And there we actually see that there is a difference, right? So earlier I mentioned that respondents labeled most of the trips, but not all of them. So we see, for example, to give you an idea, that car trips are trips that are being labeled very often. These are probably very salient trips, right? People remember what they did. And you see that these constitute a much higher proportion of the labeled trips than the unlabeled trips. And we find similar patterns for some other trips there. What we could also do here, and that's quite interesting, is actually we had some comparison data because the old Webb's diary survey was also still running at Statistics Netherlands, and we can use data from that study to compare our statistics, right? So how does it matter? And what we saw is actually that we do see differences. So we were able, when it comes to the modes of transport, we were able to get similar statistics, but we do find quite strong differences in, for example, the median duration of the trip, or the median distance by trips. And what we find is that the app is actually much better at collecting some short trips. So we know from experience that the short trips are the trips that are missing from the diary survey. And we were actually able to collect a lot of these shorter trips with the app. And this is important for policy purposes. Policymakers want to know also about the short trips that are made by bike or on foot. So measurements, yes, I think in our case, the measurement indeed was better with the app, but it took us a lot of time in terms of building the app and also in terms of modeling. Right, okay. So that's infrastructure. The third is the type of population. So here I can be very brief. I mentioned a lot of these things. Panels generally sample the general population. There's of course lots of consumer, like customer panels and all these kind of things, but it is possible nowadays to build a general population panel. And one of the advantages is if you have a very large panel is that you can actually subsample, right? And this is also something that's commonly done. With apps, we're not that far yet. So because they are expensive and because people are maybe not willing, everyone in the population is willing and able to participate in app studies, you see that populations in app studies are usually like special populations. So again, refugees, people released from prisons are examples, or small populations. So you also see a lot of voluntary opt-in samples. In a way, I think where panels were like in the late 1990s or early 2000s, this is where in terms of coverage and the type of populations that they draw, where apps are nowadays. This may change, but in fact, it also may not. All right, the fourth difference is communications. So in panels, typically email is the dominant mode of inviting people. And then they people click on a link and they complete the web survey. In apps, usually this works a bit different. So there we either invite respondents to go back to the app by, for example, providing feedback. So then they don't need an explicit invitation. But sometimes we can push people back into the app, and we typically do that using push messages. And their text messages and email really are also being used, but not as widely. So feedback and gamification are really two core differences. This is very normal in apps and not very normal in panels. In fact, people have done experiments on panels with feedback or gamification, and people have shown that it doesn't really work in terms of boosting participation rates, for example. All right, so what next, right? So where do we go from here? So internet panels are really good for the general population. They're cheap, very good for measuring long-term change because panels run for a long time, not so good at measurements. Apps are for very specific, motivated populations. They're expensive to run. They're good for measurements often, especially for specific topics. And they're actually very good for measuring short-term change, right? You can do ecological momentary assessments, use push messages, or do even continuous measurements through sensors, for example. So I think one way forward is, the obvious way forward is to actually combine some of these methods, right? So combine panels and apps. And this is, some of these ideas are not actually mine, these are very old ideas. So Nesselrode, for example, in 1991, already wrote about this idea of measurement burst designs. So this is a graph that I took from another paper. So panel studies typically sample people every year. I know internet panels do it more often, so say every month or 2 months. But in measurement burst designs, the idea is that you mix these sort of long intervals with very short intervals where you sample people once a day or even multiple times a day. And the combination of these two things can really give you all kinds of new insights about about all kinds of new topics as well. So this is actually an old idea, and by the time that Nesselrode wrote this down, it was just a hypothetical idea, but this is now possible, right, to do. It is being used as well, right, in some studies, but not as widely, I think, as can be done. So what can panels do here? What are the things that panels can maybe learn from apps? So one thing I think that apps do really well is that they actually somehow, or inherent in apps, is that you do continuous measurements, or at least that the respondent actually tunes in with the app very often. The respondent can himself decide when to participate in the app and what kind of input to provide. And we actually see that a lot of respondents are very happy to provide a lot of detailed input there. Some other things that can be done, I think, are more related to how we communicate with apps. So for example, one thing that I think panel surveys could do more with is like kind of event-driven intensive measurements. So this idea of doing these measurement bursts, you can apply it to, for example, live events. So if you somehow can convince respondents to, for example, let you know when they move house, start a new job, or become pregnant, these are like live events, and it could be for various reasons be very interesting to then more closely follow these people more intensely over this period when they actually move a house or start a new job. And the same would be for news events, right? I think panels are already very quick in, it's very easy to send out an email invitation, but on mobile phones, you could do this even faster by using push messages. There's some other possibilities as well. So you can use sensors, right, as a screening method. So there are some examples where you use geofencing. Everyone who have visited a particular area are people that you can then send a survey about that particular area, right? So imagine you could contact all the people who have visited a particular store. And I think generally this whole idea of doing ecological momentary assessment is very interesting if you can link short-term changes to actually long-term changes. There are actually existing examples of all of this, right? So I'm not the one making all this up. There's actually some really good examples. Recently, for example, in the Mannheim Corona study, they did daily questionnaires in a panel. There are numerous examples where panels have used actually accelerometers. So actually, this is not an app, but it's close to that. So SHARE has done this, the HRS, Understanding America, or the Millennium Cohort study in the UK. There are also some studies exploring the use of apps. So I already mentioned Understanding Society and PASS. And diaries are also being included in panel studies. So historically, there have been quite a few panel studies who've already included diaries in their studies. These often still are web diary studies and not app diary studies, but that's something that could be done. One problem in studies is recruitment and retaining. This is a problem in panels as well, but it's more of a problem in app studies. It's really difficult to make the apps work for the general population, and actually to make sure that an app actually goes beyond a week or so that they currently usually are used for observations. And one problem with apps is that it's a wild west out there. There are no good standards for research app development. All right, I'm looking at my time now. I still have a bit of time. I will show you a couple more slides. All right, so I want to tell you a bit more about this travel app. And also show you how unsuccessful we have been in terms of recruiting the general population. So what we wanted to do with the app is to actually recruit the general population. We didn't know how, so we did an experiment, as you do. One condition in the experiment was to actually sample people from the population register. So these are fresh people. Another, more a panel context, is to actually sample people who previously took part in this Odin travel survey. So this was a recruitment experiment. How can we recruit people into this app study? The second experiment we did was with incentives. So we varied the amount that we paid to people, but also the timing. So there were conditional incentives, but also a conditional halfway that respondents would get when registering. Okay, fieldwork followed the following logic. So we first sent people an invitation letter. This was by mail. They could then directly go to download an app using a QR code, but they could also first go to a website where there would be more information about the app. including some videos. People would then need to download the app, log in, and actually, so this is the invitation letter. This is the website where it included more information. They would have to download the app, log into the app, allow location measurements, and then they're there, right? Then that's the point where the app runs. So actually, you see there's a lot of steps here and a lot of points where respondents could actually drop out. So in total, we had 1,900 people in our sample, split into these two ways to recruit people. So either earlier web diary respondents or fresh respondents. Our response rates were the following. So 26% for fresh respondents, 44% among web diary respondents. But this 44% is of course conditional on people participating in the earlier survey. This was not it, right? So these are people downloading the app and logging in. We found that we had problems with dropouts throughout the study. So we had 17% of people dropping out almost on the first day. And these were particular people with the newest version of iOS. Again, here, you're relying for large part on these manufacturers. So iOS released a new version of their operating system just a week before we went to the field. And we had not tested this version very well. So there were some technical problems there and people dropping out. All right, so did we find an effect of the incentives? Yes, so we found here higher incentives work better. We also found that splitting this incentive up in two steps, so one for registering and one for completing the study, actually worked worse than paying everything only at the end. This is the main slide that I wanted to show you. We were in a quite unique situation that we sampled from the population register. And on the population register in the Netherlands, we have a lot of details about these people. So we know their gender, their age, their name, even when if they have a driver's license, whether they own a car or a moped, their level of education, etc., etc. So we can actually predict response here. And the table that I'm showing you here is from a logistic regression where we predict whether people participate yes or no into the app, so a binary outcome variable. And here we use all the different predictors here. And what I'm showing you are average marginal effects. So these are from the multivariate model, the difference in the predicted probability to participate. So the first number that you see here, 0.16, is actually the difference between the 27% response rate among fresh respondents and the 44% response rate among earlier respondents, right? So there's a 16% difference in the response rate. If you go down this list of numbers, you actually see some pretty strong effects, right? So you see an effect of the incentives, that's nice. You see large age effects. So for the youngest age group, 18 to 25, our response rate was about 50%. For the oldest age group, it was only 20%. So there was a 28 percentage point difference in these in the response rates between these groups. Similarly, we get very strong effects for education, with higher educated people much more likely to participate than lower educated people. So this shows that we really have a very big non-response problem. Of course, we could, now we know this, we can of course maybe correct for it, but I think this is a more general problem of research apps. All right. Importantly, finally, is that we didn't find any interaction effects, right? So if we cross the incentive groups with some of these other effects, we didn't find that the effects worked differently. All right, so this was just to give you an illustration of how much problems apps, I think, still have. That is, of course, if you do it as a standalone longitudinal panel study, right? So another way to do it is, of course, to use it within an existing panel, and then you perhaps can circumvent some of these problems. Right, we're also working on different studies at the moment, so just want to give you an overview of what we're working on now. So we're actually doing a new version of this travel survey app later this year. And we're also doing a household budget survey, so much in the same way as Understanding Society has done this later this year. And then for next year, we're focusing on time use as another statistic. All right, here are some references. I will hopefully send my slides around so you can find some of these later on. And if you would like to know more, you could also visit my website, or if you want to know more about these studies that I presented, here you can find some of the recent publications that our research group has been involved in. So thanks, and I hope there's some questions or points for discussion.
Thanks, Peter. This is terrific. So we have about a quarter of an hour as planned. So this is also amazing. There's a couple of questions in the chat. So I'll read these first, and then other people can jump in. So the first is we have worked on similar project and had a lot of issues getting approved to for Apple products, which is US based. So the question is, did you have similar issues?
Yes. So Apple generally is a bit more complicated as Google is in getting
Right.
approval. It just takes a bit more time, and they want to actually study your app, so they actually see how it works and ask you all kinds of questions. But for us, it was no problem in the end. It just took a bit more effort.
Yeah, I think we all recognize these issues. We have done similar things, and we certainly have had all of that in the change in operating systems and indeed approval times. So the other question by Annette is whether you know of any studies that have examined the effectiveness of gamified elements.
No, I think there's actually a world of research to be done there in that area. So a problem is that, I mean, this idea of gamification and feedback actually comes from app development, right? Right. Apps commonly do this, right? If you have Google Maps, Google sends you, if you use Google Maps and you turn this on, Google sends you an overview every month of how far you've traveled and the places you've visited. So this is very common. But one problem, I think, with apps, so the way to find this out is to actually do experiments, right? So this is typically how you would develop two versions of the app, one with some gamification, for example, and one with a lot of gamification. And then you can track whether people go back to the app more often or whether you retain them better. But it also means that you have to actually produce two versions of the app. And if you're a big techno company, you can probably do this. But if you're just a researcher, it's actually it just takes even more time and effort and money. So it's definitely something that's on our list to investigate, but it's not the easiest thing to do.
So this nicely feeds into the next question, whether you have actually done experiments where you compared giving feedback to not giving feedback. Or where you compare different kinds of feedback.
So this is something that we are actually doing this year in one of these new app studies that we're doing. Both giving the feedback and not doing it, but also the extent to which you give feedback, because you can do like elaborate feedback or not so elaborate.
Right.
Yeah, because there is a worry, I think, among some people that the giving feedback would actually, there's this literature on penal conditioning, right? So if you give feedback, it may actually change people's behavior. I don't know, in spending, for example, right? If you see that you spend all this money on ice cream, you may think like, oh, I should buy less ice cream and more healthy foods or something like that. This is a worry that people have. To be honest, there are a couple of studies that I have looked into this. They have not really found very big effects. But again, here it may also depend a bit on the topic. I don't think that your household spending is going to change all of a sudden. But I don't know, maybe in time use or something like that, I can imagine that there perhaps could be some effects.
Yeah. So another question is, what method would you recommend to ensure that app users turn on the app when they are supposed to record designated events?
Yes. So this has actually become, I sort of glanced over this in my talk, but this is becoming more of a problem more recently. A few years ago, it was just a matter, you installed the app and it would just keep running on your phone forever and ever, right? Until you turn it off at some point. Nowadays, this is no longer the case. So actually, the phone itself will determine if you don't interact with an app often enough, that it just draining your battery, and it will turn it off automatically. So you have to devise some intelligent ways to sort of circumvent this. But this is getting harder and harder. And so we actually, in our app study, we already had a lot of missing data due to the app switching off. And then we just miss respondents for sometimes a short period and sometimes a longer period. And this is actually becoming more of a problem nowadays.
Yeah. So another question that I have is, and it may be somewhat typical for the US environment. I mean, there are obvious privacy issues with, for example, following people's location. So people have to provide consent, and I think one of the issues is really the number of people who will provide consent, for example, to have their movements tracked. And we've certainly seen this in other contexts where, for example, we try to record financial transactions. So there is a concern by people, and probably going up because of all the news stories about hacking, about their privacy and what happens if they allow you to, for example, follow where they are all the time. And I don't know whether that varies a lot across countries. I don't know, for example, whether that's a concern that's as prominent in the Netherlands as it is in the United States.
It's certainly a concern in many European countries, I think. Our regulations, we have the famous GDPR regulations that have some pretty strict guidelines on what you can and cannot do. But yes, this is certainly an issue. I think, I mean, so one thing that you need is some form of trust between the research organization and the respondents as a precondition, I think. And then second, what you need is, as a researcher, you need to convincingly explain why you actually need this data, why it's important. So actually, Bella Suminskaya, in the next session, we've done some experiments here on how to ask for all these kind of questions. And well, I'm not going to give away her talk, but no, it is an issue. But I think it's really important that we can actually explain it convincingly. Why do we need to track respondents? If you do a travel app, I think it makes sense. Respondents will understand that, well, you want to produce travel statistics, then you need to track people. But we had discussions, for example, of also doing this in the time use app. So in the time use app, we could also track people. It would help, right? We would get some idea of when people are moving and when they're maybe at home and at work. But maybe then it's not really so central to the purpose of the study to actually do location tracking, right? The purpose of the study is to monitor people's time use. So maybe, so in that case, actually, we now decided against doing that for that reason. But maybe if you have a convincing story, you could also do that.
So by the way, I think when you talked about the recruitment rates, this was about travel, right? Didn't you say you had a recruitment rate of 20% or so at the end?
Yeah, so 27% among fresh respondents. So that, I
mean, actually, I think it's higher than what most of us would have anticipated.
Yeah, it's not bad, right? We were actually we did a bet. So all the people who were involved in the study in advance, we estimated what the response proportion was going to be, and I think we were all lower than a 20. So we were all positively surprised. However, of course, I mean, the response rate is nice, but what matters is non-response bias, I think, right? And there we really have a problem.
Okay.
Ari, can I ask a question?
Yeah, go for it, Marco.
Hi, Peter. So this is more of a curiosity. I just want to know your opinion. I'm not tech savvy enough to assess if what I'm going to say is feasible at all or not. But can you see a future where a panel comes up with an app that uses somehow existing things on a smartphone to collect information, or APIs? For instance, instead of having an app that is just a travel app, you have an app for the panel that then uses Google Maps to track where you are. Or in the example that Ari mentioned for the UAS, we are using the API of a company to collect, of a financial aggregator to collect financial information. So you can ask for consent through the app and get that information as well. What do you think? Is too crazy, or it's not feasible at all?
No, it's not crazy. Actually, there are apps that do this, right? That rely on data that's being collected in other apps, and they kind of piggyback on that. So that is a possibility. However, not with all the apps, right? So, for example, you can't just make an app that would then read out all your WhatsApp messages.
I think each panel would have to decide what type of topics are more important and relevant, or where the measurement issues are larger.
But also this is not possible with all the apps, right? You can't, for example, monitor the Facebook app on someone's phone through a third app, through another app. And so in principle, yes, but in practice, it's actually quite complicated. Working through this API, so to actually do this linkages, that is another thing that's possible, right? So I'm sure we have all had these messages that when you log into something with a user account from, for example, your Gmail account, that it says we're going to get access to the following details from Google to log into this app. So there are ways to make that work as well. But again, you would have to devise something that's very specific to a very specific app. And again, both for Android and iOS, who have very different regulations on these different things. What we wanted to do in the app is actually to make sure that the app worked the same way on iOS and on Android, so that we get the same type of data on both ecosystems. And that is something that is actually very, very hard. And that I would say almost like impossible, because the two operating systems work in such different ways.
I see.
So,
thank you.
Yeah, so sort of, since I guess we're sort of in the era of, we can fantasize about what you can do. So we're about to start a pilot on pollution measurement, where people wear a pollution device. It talks to their phone, so the phone gives them readings of the air quality, and of course, we have access to that. Of course, if you combine that now with location information, then you get into a really strong position to measure pollution and how it relates to what people are doing. But, of course, what you'll do is you'll ask some questions about whether they're in a car, whether they're at home. But of course, if you combine that with location information, then you probably get very powerful data, right? So that's an example, I think, where you want to combine apps in some ways.
It would be possible, at least theoretically, but you have to make it work in practice, and it requires some time and effort by programmers.
Yeah. So there's a question: would you say contact tracing is an example of the panel plus app approach that you mentioned?
So what is who
asked this for COVID, right? There's contact tracing for right, whether or not you have been infected, I guess, something like that.
Yeah. Well, typically these apps don't start from a panel, I think, right? COVID tracing. So my idea would be, or one idea is to actually start with an existing panel, and then within the panels, tell respondents we now also have this app. And with the app, so we want to, in particular, measure the following things, like household spending or your location, or do a diary study, or whatever it is that I think from a substantive point of view is interesting to you as a panel. I think that's where.
Yeah. Any other questions? So we're sort of at the end of the hour. So this is terrific. Many thanks, Peter. I'm certainly looking forward to new adventures in this new world of using apps and panels. So it's great. Thank you very much.